At 7:07 a.m. on March 15th, 2001, the Fort Bragg Military Police received a frantic call from the
There are
residential housing
gunshots!
area
Oh
near
God, there are
Smoke Bomb
gunshots!
Hill.
A woman is lying
A
on the
dependent
sidewalk!
spouse, her
He's
voice
walking
trembling
away!
with panic,
He's just
reported
walking
hearing
away!
gunshots. Through her panicked breaths, she described seeing a woman lying motionless on a sidewalk outside the base medical center. She also saw the shooter, a man in military fatigues who didn't run or speed away in a vehicle. He simply turned and walked away from the scene with a calm, deliberate pace. Military police units raced to the location, preparing for a dangerous manhunt in the sprawling military installation. But the suspect wasn't hiding, and the pursuit they expected never happened. Instead, what they found waiting for them was somehow far more unsettling. Dr. Margaret Whitmore was, by every public measure, a success. At 43 years old, she was a highly respected ophthalmologic surgeon at Womack Army Medical Center, earning an annual salary of over $380,000 through her civilian contract with the Department of Defense. Her colleagues on the hospital's medical review board praised her technical skill, pointing to a high success rate in complex vision-saving procedures. She had built a pristine reputation from a prestigious education at Duke University Medical School and a background rooted in an upper-middle-class family from Charlotte, North Carolina. Her life outside the hospital reflected this success. A $950,000 home in Fayetteville's most exclusive neighborhood, a silver Lexus RX 350, and a social calendar filled with the city's elite. Divorced with no children, her life was her career. However, beneath the polished surface was a well-documented professional flaw. Hospital records and patient reviews, which would later be scrutinized by military investigators, revealed a distinct pattern in her behavior. While officers' families and those with premium TRICARE coverage received lengthy, attentive consultations, enlisted personnel and their families with standard military insurance reported a different experience. They described Dr. Whitmore as cold, dismissive, and impatient. Consultations were often cut short. Questions were brushed aside with technical jargon, and a clear sense of irritation was noted by family members. This wasn't just a poor bedside manner. It was a consistent bias that separated her patients by rank and status. Her world of precision and privilege was orderly and sterile, far removed from the lives of the enlisted families who sometimes ended up in her care. In late 1999, that sterile world was about to collide with a family who had nothing but each other when a referral for a 34-year-old military spouse named Jennifer Hayes landed on her desk. Lieutenant Colonel David Hayes' world revolved around his wife. At 41, Hayes was a decorated combat veteran and logistics officer with the 82nd Airborne Division who had already endured significant hardship. After losing both parents in a house fire years earlier, his 34-year-old wife, Jennifer, became the sole focus of his life outside his military duties. Jennifer, a former elementary school teacher from rural Tennessee, was a warm and devoted woman who had followed David through 7 different duty stations over their 12-year marriage. When she was diagnosed with advanced cataracts in both eyes in late 1999, an unusually early onset likely caused by prolonged exposure to harsh sunlight during their posting in Kuwait, David dedicated himself entirely to her care. He researched specialists, attended every appointment, and meticulously documented every detail. His only goal was to see her through the surgery that promised to restore her vision. On February 8, 2000, David and Jennifer sat in the sterile waiting room of Dr. Margaret Whitmore's office at Womack Army Medical Center. According to David's later statements to the Criminal Investigation Command, he watched Dr. Whitmore spend nearly 50 minutes with the colonel's wife before them, laughing and speaking warmly about vacation plans. When the Hayes were finally called in, the atmosphere changed instantly. The consultation lasted only 9 minutes. Dr. Whitmore barely made eye contact with Jennifer, directing her highly technical explanations at David in rapid medical terminology. When Jennifer tried to ask a question about recovery time, the surgeon appeared visibly irritated, checking her watch. David's questions about complication rates were met with a curt, dismissive response. "It's routine. Thousands of these are done every year." Before they could process what was happening, the meeting was over and a nurse was handing them consent forms. David left that office with a growing sense of unease. As an officer who had spent 2 decades in the military, he recognized the subtle hierarchy at play, a difference in the standard of care that seemed to be based on their status as a mid-level officer's family rather than senior leadership. He saw a doctor who viewed his wife not as a person, but as a low-priority procedure. But with the surgery scheduled and few other options available within the military medical system, he pushed his doubts aside and put his faith in the institution he had served. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. On the morning of April 3, 2000, Jennifer Hayes was admitted to Womack Army Medical Center at 6 a.m. for bilateral cataract surgery. David, in his dress uniform, stayed with her until she was taken to pre-op, reassuring her that everything would be fine and that she'd finally be able to see clearly again. Dr. Whitmore, meanwhile, arrived at the hospital nearly an hour later, 45 minutes behind schedule. Hospital records later noted she had attended a medical conference dinner the previous evening. The surgery began at 8:30 a.m. For the first 40 minutes, the procedure on Jennifer's right eye appeared to be routine. Then at 9:47 a.m., the first critical error occurred. According to the subsequent military medical malpractice investigation conducted by the Army Medical Command, Dr. Whitmore miscalculated the intraocular lens power. Instead of remeasuring, she proceeded with the incorrectly sized implant. Shortly after, while removing the cataractus lens material, her phacoemulsification probe applied excessive ultrasound energy, causing thermal damage to the corneal endothelium. A severe but potentially manageable mistake had it been noticed in time. It was not. At 10:18 a.m., alarms sounded in the operating room as Jennifer's intraocular pressure spiked dangerously. The surgical team discovered significant corneal edema and anterior chamber inflammation caused by the 2 unaddressed errors. As they attempted to begin surgery on the second eye, Jennifer's condition deteriorated rapidly. What should have been a routine outpatient procedure turned into an emergency. Despite frantic attempts to stabilize her, Jennifer suffered a rare but catastrophic complication: malignant hyperthermia triggered by the anesthesia, likely exacerbated by the surgical stress her body had already endured. At 11:34 a.m., Jennifer Hayes was pronounced dead. 45 minutes later, Dr. Whitmore entered the family waiting room, where Lieutenant Colonel Hayes was sitting in his uniform, alone. The conversation, as David would later recount to military investigators, lasted less than 90 seconds. The surgeon was clinical and showed no emotion. She stated that his wife had an unexpected reaction to anesthesia and that these complications, while rare, do happen. She offered no apology, no details about the surgical errors, and no comfort. Then she turned and walked away, leaving David alone in the silent waiting room to process the fact that his wife was gone. In the weeks following his wife's death, Lieutenant Colonel David Hayes was consumed by grief. His base quarters became a silent memorial to the only family he had left. He requested and was granted emergency leave from his command. The isolation was shattered when a detailed medical bill arrived from the hospital for $67,400, charges not fully covered by his TRICARE benefits due to certain ancillary services. Staring at the cold demand for payment for the procedure that killed her, David's grief began to harden into suspicion. He submitted 23 formal requests through the Patient Advocate Office at Womack Army Medical Center, requesting his wife's complete medical records and an explanation of what went wrong. Each request was met with bureaucratic delays and incomplete documentation. Frustrated and stonewalled by the system he had served for 20 years, David used his savings to hire Marcus Randolph, a civilian attorney specializing in military medical malpractice. One of the most difficult areas of law due to the Ferris Doctrine, which typically bars service members and their families from suing the military for negligence. Randolph immediately filed a Federal Tort Claims Act request and obtained the complete, unredacted case file from the hospital, including the detailed operative report from Jennifer's surgery. He then sent the entire file to Dr. Catherine Morrison, an independent ophthalmologic surgeon and retired Air Force colonel with a reputation for giving blunt, unbiased reviews. For weeks, David waited at his duty station, mechanically going through the motions of his job, hoping for an answer that would either confirm his fears or allow him to finally let go. The answer arrived on June 22, 2000, in the form of Dr. Morrison's official report. The findings were not ambiguous, they were damning. Dr. Morrison stated in clear and unequivocal terms that the operative report showed clear indication of surgical error. She concluded that the intraocular lens calculation was inappropriate for the patient's eye measurements. The thermal injury to the cornea suggested a lack of proper technique, and that while Jennifer's death was ultimately caused by malignant hyperthermia, the surgical errors had created unnecessary complications that contributed to the fatal cascade of events. The report concluded that Jennifer Hayes' death was preventable with proper surgical technique and appropriate preoperative assessment. For David, this report was everything. It was the proof that his wife's death wasn't just an unfortunate medical complication. It was the result of fatal, inexcusable mistakes. Armed with the expert's report, David's attorney filed a Federal Tort Claims Act administrative claim against the Department of Defense and Womack Army Medical Center on July 17, 2000. The response was immediate and institutional. The Army's legal team filed a response citing the Ferris Doctrine and arguing that, as a military dependent, Jennifer's care fell under military jurisdiction and therefore had limited legal recourse. They claimed that Dr. Whitmore's actions, while unfortunate in outcome, fell within the acceptable standard of care. Throughout the summer and fall, David sat through depositions and administrative hearings, watching as Dr. Whitmore, now represented by Department of Defense attorneys, showed no remorse. During her own deposition in September, she stated coldly that the procedure was performed according to protocol and that the fatal reaction to anesthesia, while tragic, was an unforeseeable complication. She made no mention of her own surgical errors. The legal system that David had put his faith in began to systematically dismantle his case. The government's lawyers buried him in procedural motions. In November, the administrative claim was denied, with the Army's claims office offering a settlement of $125,000, an amount that would barely cover the medical bills and funeral costs. The offer was conditional. David had to sign a release waiving all future claims and agree that no wrongdoing had occurred. The final blow came on December 18th, when the civilian attorney informed David that pursuing a lawsuit in federal court would be nearly impossible due to legal precedents protecting military medical personnel. Their chances of winning at trial were estimated at less than 10%. Feeling defeated, financially drained, and emotionally exhausted, David accepted the settlement on January 9, 2001. After all the attorney fees were paid, he was left with just $34,000. Dr. Whitmore never attended the settlement meeting and never offered an apology. David left the legal office with a check in his pocket, but with no justice, no accountability, and no closure. The system he had served faithfully for 20 years had delivered its final insulting verdict. His wife's life didn't matter enough. The failed claim was the breaking point. With no legal recourse left, Lieutenant Colonel David Hayes spiraled into a deep and isolating depression. He continued reporting to his logistics battalion, but his performance declined noticeably. His commander referred him to Behavioral Health Services, where he attended 3 mandatory sessions before stopping. His base quarters became a dark space filled with his wife's photographs, stacks of legal documents, and printouts about medical malpractice. He stopped interacting with his fellow officers and spent his off-duty hours consumed by a singular burning obsession: Dr. Margaret Whitmore. Her life, unlike his, had continued without interruption. Her contract with Womack Army Medical Center had been renewed. She continued performing surgeries. Driven by a feeling of profound powerlessness and rage, David began conducting surveillance. He would drive his personal vehicle, a 1998 Jeep Cherokee, to Fayetteville after duty hours. He would park at different locations, watching Dr. Whitmore's expensive home from a distance. He saw her leave for the country club, return with shopping bags, and host dinner parties. To David, every light on in her house was a symbol of the injustice he had suffered. He was watching a woman who had, in his eyes, taken a life without consequence. and the military system had protected her. His grief curdled into a cold, methodical anger. On February 24, 2001, that anger took a concrete form. David drove to a gun store in Fayetteville called Southern Defense Outfitters. As an active-duty military officer with a security clearance and no criminal history, his background check cleared instantly. He legally purchased a Beretta M9 9mm handgun, the same sidearm issued to military personnel, and several boxes of ammunition, telling the clerk he wanted it for personal home defense off base. He left the store with the weapon secured in a case on his passenger seat. He was no longer just watching, he was now preparing. The purchase of the gun was the final turning point. In the 2 weeks that followed, Lieutenant Colonel David Hayes' actions became methodical and precise. He took the Beretta M9 to a civilian shooting range in Spring Lake on 3 separate occasions, familiarizing himself with the weapon he had last qualified with on a military range 2 years earlier. His surveillance of Dr. Whitmore intensified, shifting from aimless observation to data collection. He documented her daily schedule in a small green military notebook, noting that she arrived at Womack Army Medical Center between 7 and 7:15 a.m. every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, that she usually parked in the same section of the medical staff lot, and that she walked the same route from her car to the building entrance. By March 14, 2001, his plan was fully formed. That evening, he sat at his desk in his base quarters and wrote 2 letters. The first was a 16-page detailed account of his wife's death, the surgical errors, the failed legal claim, and the systemic indifference that had pushed him to this point. He addressed it simply, "To whom it may concern," and placed it in an envelope marked for his battalion commander. The second letter was shorter, written to the only person he felt would understand. It was a note to his wife, which he planned to leave at her gravesite at the Fort Bragg Cemetery. In it he wrote, "Jenny, I'm sorry, but I can't let her get away with what she did to you. She didn't care that you died. She didn't care about you at all. The Army protected her, and no one held her accountable. I have to make this right. I know this means I'll lose everything, but you were my everything. I love you." He placed both letters in his desk drawer, changed into his duty uniform, and spent the night sitting in silence. His preparations were now complete. He had the weapon. He had studied his target's routine, and he had written his final explanation. All that was left was to choose the moment. On the morning of Thursday, March 15, 2001, Lieutenant Colonel David Hayes drove onto Fort Bragg in his military uniform, as he had done thousands of times before. Instead of reporting to his battalion headquarters, he parked his Jeep Cherokee in a visitor lot near Womack Army Medical Center at 6:45 a.m. The Beretta M9, loaded with a full 15-round magazine, was concealed in his cargo pocket. He waited in his vehicle watching the staff parking lot. At 7:09 a.m., just as his notebook predicted, Dr. Whitmore's silver Lexus pulled into her usual parking space. She exited her vehicle carrying her briefcase and a coffee cup, dressed in surgical scrubs beneath a white coat. David stepped out of his Jeep and walked directly toward her with measured military precision. According to witness statements from other medical staff arriving for duty and David's own later confession to the Criminal Investigation Command, Dr. Whitmore was initially startled, but not alarmed. Seeing a soldier in uniform approaching wasn't unusual on a military installation. When he stopped directly in front of her and stated his name and rank, she didn't immediately recognize him. When he identified himself as Jennifer Hayes' husband, her expression shifted from confusion to recognition, then to visible annoyance. "That matter was resolved, Colonel," she told him dismissively. "You need to move on." She attempted to walk around him toward the hospital entrance. That cold dismissal, identical to the one she delivered in the waiting room nearly a year earlier, was the final trigger. As Dr. Whitmore turned her back on him to continue walking, a final act of disregard, David pulled out the Beretta M9. For the first time, she saw the weapon, and her irritation was replaced by terror. A nearby medical technician who witnessed the confrontation later testified that he heard Dr. Whitmore say, "Please don't do this. I'm sorry." The words came too late and rang hollow. At 7:11 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel David Hayes fired 4 shots in rapid succession. 2 struck Dr. Whitmore in the upper chest, 1 hit her in the shoulder, and the 4th missed, striking the concrete wall of the medical center. She collapsed on the sidewalk outside the facility where she had worked. For a moment, David stood over her body, the smoking pistol still in his hand, his expression later described by witnesses as simply empty, the look of a man who had nothing left to lose. As a security guard shouted into his radio and medical staff screamed, David didn't run. Following years of military discipline, he carefully safed the weapon, set it on the ground, and raised his hands above his head. He then assumed the position he had been trained to adopt, kneeling with his hands interlaced behind his head, waiting for military police to arrive. When the MPs arrived with weapons drawn 90 seconds later, he complied with every command without resistance. His first words to the responding military police sergeant were direct and without emotion. I did it. I shot her. She killed my wife and nobody held her accountable. I'm ready to face the consequences. For the lead investigators from the Army Criminal Investigation Command, Special Agents Robert Chen and Patricia Donovan, the case seemed straightforward. They had multiple eyewitnesses, security camera footage, the murder weapon, and a suspect who had already given a full confession. But that afternoon, after David was formally placed in pre-trial confinement at the Fort Bragg Regional Confinement Facility, Agent Donovan executed a search authorization on his base quarters, and the case began to change. On his desk, she found both letters he had left behind. She sat in her government vehicle in the parking lot and read all 16 pages of the first letter. It was not the rambling manifesto of a madman. It was a methodical, heartbreakingly detailed account of his wife's death, the surgical errors documented by an independent expert, the dismissive treatment by the hospital, the institutional barriers of the military legal system, and the crushing weight of a justice system that he felt had protected the doctor while ignoring his family's suffering. Agent Donovan was a veteran CID investigator who had seen countless motives for violence. But this was different. The letter didn't excuse the crime, but it explained it with a painful clarity. The evidence clearly showed premeditated murder. But as Donovan finished the last page, she began to wonder about the deeper questions the case raised. Questions about institutional accountability, about the difference between legal justice and moral justice, and about what happens when a person who has dedicated their life to serving a system believes that same system has utterly failed them. The man in confinement was unquestionably a killer. But as she documented the evidence, Agent Donovan couldn't shake the feeling that he was also, in some profound way, a victim of the very institution he had sworn to defend. Lieutenant Colonel David Hayes' court-martial in October 2001 at Fort Bragg captured national attention, becoming a flashpoint for public debate about military medical accountability and the limits of justice. The prosecution, led by a team of aggressive Army JAG officers, painted the picture of a trained military officer who violated everything the uniform stood for, painting a clear timeline of premeditation, the surveillance, the gun purchase, the written confessions, and the cold-blooded execution of an unarmed civilian on a military installation. In response, his military defense counsel argued it was a case that should be considered under extreme emotional disturbance, telling the story of a decorated officer and grieving husband pushed past his breaking point by a negligent doctor and a military medical system that had utterly failed him. Evidence of Dr. Whitmore's surgical errors, the damning expert report on Jennifer's death, and documentation of 3 previous malpractice settlements she had reached in civilian practice before joining the military medical system were laid bare for the court-martial panel to see. Against his defense counsel's advice, David himself testified in uniform. He was honest and raw, admitting his crime was wrong and that he understood the consequences, but refusing to apologize for the rage that fueled it. My wife died because a doctor made mistakes she never acknowledged, and the system I served for 20 years protected that doctor instead of my family. He told the silent courtroom, filled with military officers. I know I violated my oath. I know I have to pay for what I did, but I want this court to understand. Jennifer's life mattered. She deserved better than what she got. After 3 days of deliberation, the 8-member court-martial panel, consisting of 5 officers and 3 senior enlisted members, returned a verdict, guilty of premeditated murder. They acknowledged the emotional circumstances but could not condone an officer taking the law into his own hands. The panel sentenced him to 35 years in military prison at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He was also dishonorably discharged, forfeiting all military rank, benefits, and retirement pay he had earned over 2 decades of service. In the years that followed, the case left a complicated and tragic legacy. Dr. Whitmore's death triggered an internal review by the Army Medical Command, which quietly revised its quality control policies and oversight procedures after her 3 previous civilian malpractice settlements were unsealed, revealing a pattern of negligence that had somehow been missed during her military contract vetting process. The case itself became a focal point in ongoing debates about the Ferris Doctrine and whether military families deserve the same legal protections as civilians. It became a stark example of how institutions can fail individuals and what can happen when grief meets a system that seems designed to protect itself rather than deliver justice. David Hayes was a model prisoner. Throughout his incarceration at Fort Leavenworth, he maintained exemplary conduct, earned multiple educational certifications, and participated in veteran peer counseling programs. After being denied parole twice, his sentence was reduced for good behavior, and he was released in November 2024 at 64 years old, having served 23 years. He now lives quietly in Tennessee, Jennifer's home state, working with a veterans legal aid organization that helps military families navigate medical malpractice claims and appeals, trying in whatever way he can to ensure that no other family suffers the same institutional failures that destroyed his life.